We're going to be learning a lot about Myers-Briggs in a series of videos. Each video is going to go over the different components of type and the facets that make up that type. And in doing so, you're going to learn more about your type, and you're going to learn about the components of your type that make you who you are and influence how you behave, and also have a lot of presence in your relationship with other people and how that presence might create conflict or similarity. And so we're going to dive into that in this assignment. But first, I want to talk to you about what Myers-Briggs is and where it came from and what it means. So MBTI stands for the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. It is an assessment of personality. We might also refer to it as an instrument. So it's essentially a tool that helps people to figure out their type. I want to be very clear that it is not a test. A lot of people talk about the MBTI as a test that they took, and it's not a test. A test implies that something is right or wrong, and this is not a right or wrong thing. This is a series of questions. The instrument itself is a series of questions that indicate your preference for type. And there's no right or wrong here. Every single type has strengths and weaknesses. They have blind spots, things that they don't see or understand that the other side might. And so there's no right or wrong. Your type is your type. But what the indicator does, the instrument, it helps you to figure out what that type is. Now, here's the thing about the instrument. There is a paid version that is very well researched and has been in circulation for the last 60 years, and it's really, really effective at determining type. And there's actually a more detailed version of that instrument called the Type 2 indicator that is even more detailed and more specific and really generally is pretty spot on. However, those things cost money. That's what many corporations will use to figure out the types of some of their employees to help them really be in the best position for their type. We are not going to take the instrument because I feel like the free version of that is not really the best possible way to determine type. You know, having these forced choice responses might yield a false negative or a false positive, and you may not totally identify with that. So instead, I'm going to give you information, and you are going to self-assess based on that information and choose based on the different facets I present to you. You're going to choose your type. So I'll talk to you about how to do that, and I'll give you all the information you need. But for now, let's just learn a little bit more about the background. So it all began with Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a very famous, still one of the world's most famous psychologists. He worked under Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was his mentor. And so he learned a lot from Sigmund Freud, but where they actually differed in their understanding of psychology was that Carl Jung believed that when we exhibit who we are as human beings, that generally is present for our entire lives. It's not something that our parents or our communities teach us. It is something we are born with. And so it is an innate preference for who we are. And what Carl Jung also theorized was that these differences that exist between people are not random, but instead they fall along these patterns, these types that he started to create in the early part of the 20th century. So in 1921, he published Psychological Types, and then it was translated into English. And I'm not going to lie, I've tried to read this book. It is incredibly difficult. But he started essentially a revolution. And so when Psychological Types reached America, it was picked up by Catherine C. Briggs, who was a student of psychology, and she read it, and then she devoted the next 2 decades of her life really developing Jung's theory and creating something that would help people to more effectively understand that theory. Her daughter, Isabel Briggs Myers, picked up where her mother left off when she was elderly and no longer able to engage in the work in the same way. She began in 1943 to develop these questions that has now become the instrument that Myers-Briggs uses to assess personality type. And so she has been working on this. I mean, she's already gone. She died in 1980, but she worked on this her entire life. And what she developed is now used in Fortune 500 companies and corporations. It is used around the world, and it is widely recognized as one of the most accurate personality assessments. Now, I'm not here to say that there are several others. The Big Five is one of them. The Enneagram is another. I am I can facilitator. I have the Myers-Briggs facilitation certificate. So that's, something that I'm very well versed in. I've also trained in the Enneagram. So those are two that I'm familiar with. The Big Five, not as much, although I've certainly done a good deal of reading about it. And I'm not going to tell you that I think one is better than the other. This just happens to be the one that I am most familiar with. And it's also the one that I think works best for college students who are just learning about personality. All right, so Isabel Briggs Myers took Jung's theory, which Jung's theory was that extroversion and introversion are a thing. People definitely are living in either an outer world that's made up of all the things and the people and the events and all the things that are going on outside of that person, and who are energized by that and engaged with that. And then there's this inner world that we have these thoughts and feelings and reflections about what's happening outside of us. And that it seemed like people had a preference for one of those two worlds. And that's what created this idea of introversion and extroversion. What Jung also believed was that those preferences are innate. In other words, we are born with a preference for this behavior, and that if we are exhibiting something that is not innate, that we can still exhibit that behavior, but it may not feel comfortable to us. So one is nature. One is that we are born that way. That's nature. And then nurture is we are influenced by our parents, by our communities to behave in certain ways. So I like to use the concept of handedness to help demonstrate this. And what I'm going to have all of you do real quick is grab a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil. And it doesn't have to be fancy. It can be the back of an envelope, anything that's nearby. So go ahead and grab a piece of paper and a pen. I'll wait a couple seconds here. And now I want you to sign your name. It's just like you're signing a check or a contract. Just sign your name. And that should take you seconds because it's something that most people are used to doing. All right, now I want you to put that pen or pencil in the other hand and sign your name. And I gave you a bit of a pause there because I know, having done this many times before, that it takes longer, it's messy, you have to think about it, it's uncomfortable. You're probably laughing at yourself because it might look like a hot mess. So this notion of handedness is the same thing we're talking about with preferences with the Myers-Briggs type indicator. We are born with a dominant hand, righty or lefty. And we may find ourselves influenced by our environment to use the opposite hand. So for instance, it's really not in practice anymore, but some of you may have parents or grandparents who went to Catholic school in the early part of the 20th century, mid or even like late 20th century, where they were told that writing with the left hand was not allowed, and they were with corporal punishment, like slapping of rulers, they were taught to use their right hand. And so they had to learn how to use the opposite hand. That's certainly an environmental influence to use one hand over the other, and it would teach a person how to be ambidextrous. If you break a hand, if you break your dominant hand, you have to learn how to use the other hand to write, to eat, to do everything that you need to do. And so you will learn, and the environment has influenced your ability to use that other hand. Now, all of us do use both hands. We are capable of doing so. In fact, we might find that we use one hand for certain tasks more so than the others, but that one feels more automatic for us. Just like when you were signing your name, it was more automatic to use your dominant hand. It felt comfortable, it felt natural. The signature shows that. When you have to use the other hand, it doesn't feel comfortable, it doesn't feel natural, it doesn't feel automatic, and the signature shows that. And so this is very much in alignment with this idea behind Myers-Briggs, which is that we have these pairs of opposites. We have extroversion and introversion. We have intuitive and sensing, thinking and feeling, judging and perceiving. And we have a preference for one over the other as human beings. Some of us might actually kind of fall right in the middle, where our preferences are only slightly for one over the other. And that's kind of like being ambidextrous. In fact, when people fall in the middle between extrovert and introvert, we call it ambivert. And so we can have a preference for both or feel comfortable with both. But the reason I teach the facets when we get into the nitty gritty of each of these types, it helps us to understand why. It helps us to really see what about each side we identify with so that we can be clearer about our own type. So these 16 total combinations of types are as follows. And you can see we have introvert I, extrovert E, sensing is S, intuitive is N, F is feeling, T is thinking, P is perceiving, J is judging. And these are the types that at the end of this assignment, you're going to know where you fall. So if you have 5 facets, like when you're reading about the facets of introversion and extroversion, and all 5 of the extroverted facets, you read those and you're like, that's me, that's totally me. Guess what? You're an extrovert. All 5 facets, that is a strong preference for extroversion. If you had 4 of the 5 that you identified with in extroversion, you have a strong preference for extroversion. If you have 3, then you have, a moderate. So you have you can go from strong to moderate. You can, go down to, if you have like half and half, then it can be a slight preference for extroversion. Because if you have 3 under extroversion, you have 2 under introversion, and that's just a slight preference. Don't worry about the language of slight preference, moderate preference, strong preference. Worry more about when we get into the facet language. Which of these types do you feel most aligned with, and which of the facets do you feel most aligned with, so that you can analyze that. And when you are done doing that analysis, you're going to know your type, you're going to know your initials, and you might be curious how you stack up in the world. This is sort of a rough analysis based on people who take the official Myers-Briggs type indicator instrument. And you can see that, no one type has the largest purchase over the entire world population. The highest are the ESTJs and the ISTJs. So the STJ seems to stand out pretty strongly at 12%. But even then, it's not an enormous percentage. The lowest percent, for those who are curious, is the ESTP. That is the least common type in the world. But you're always going to be able to find your people here. So when you learn about Myers-Briggs, it's a great way to connect to others and to learn about, okay, well, oh, we're both extroverts. Oh, we're both thinking types. And then we can make those connections. The paper I'm asking you to write is to analyze one relationship within your life, past or present, to another person, and to think about how your Myers-Briggs type shows up in that relationship. And I want to encourage you also to learn about their type, or to think about their type. What do you know about them that has you believing that maybe they fall into an opposite category as you, or the same? And how does that influence your relationship? So I'm excited to read these analyses. I'm excited to learn about your types as you learn about them. And as you watch the rest of the video series and you learn about Myers-Briggs, if you have questions, please let me know.